Since the start of 2026, the atmosphere in Chinese society appears, on the surface, largely unchanged. People still go to work, shops remain open, and official statistics continue to be released, according to schedule. Yet beneath this thin veneer of normalcy, the social psyche has unmistakably begun to reconfigure itself. For many citizens in the past, silence was the safest form of self-defense. Not arguing, not speaking out, not openly expressing dissatisfaction. This was the most realistic way to survive. However, as even the most minimal hopes have been repeatedly crushed, silence has ceased to function as a shield. Expanding unemployment, stagnant incomes, rising living costs, and a dimming outlook for the future have gradually eroded people's internal capacity to endure. As experiences accumulate, losing one's job, attempting to seek relief through petitions or legal channels only to achieve nothing, anger and resignation have begun to pile up simultaneously across society. What emerges from this is not mere complaint, but a transformation in patterns of behavior themselves. Since 2025, a particularly notable development is that political messages have no longer remained confined to online spaces, but have begun seeping into physical public environments. Short, sharp phrases have appeared on bridge pillars, overpasses, building facades, and even in unexpected locations. Language is no longer limited to symbolism. It is increasingly pointing directly at the structures of power themselves. People are moving beyond the stage of expressing intent solely through oblique metaphors. This shift is especially pronounced among younger generations. Some of those born after 2000 no longer accept as self-evident the framework once regarded as an unquestionable life formula: buying a home, getting married, and having children. The logic that lifelong debt for homeownership equals stability is now openly challenged. Even in everyday conversation, choosing not to buy property, not to marry, and not to have children is no longer an isolated deviation, but is spreading as a calculated decision. Meanwhile, in the realm of consumption, the erosion of trust is accelerating rapidly. Prices rise while quality remains unchanged. Clothing that once cost 199 yuan is now sold for 599 yuan with the same materials and texture. Convenience foods have become more expensive, yet their contents remain the same. Only the marketing slogans on the packaging have multiplied. The more domestic brands emphasize patriotism, the more consumers begin to perceive it not as value, but as a pricing strategy. As competition weakens and choices narrow, some companies increasingly resort to aggressive pricing, an experience that steadily accumulates in the lived reality of consumers. On this terrain, the forms of protest expression have also evolved. It is no longer just banners, large projected text, messages appearing on building walls at night, and visualization techniques that vanish quickly yet leave a strong impression have emerged. In a society densely covered by surveillance cameras, the risks of action remain high. Nevertheless, the mere fact that messages appear at all is significant. Fear has not disappeared. Rather, the sense of being driven into a dead end has begun to outweigh it. What troubles those in power is that these expressions do not appear to be driven by a single organization or unified command. Instead, they are fragmented and sporadic, emerging across different regions. What they share, however, is a far more explicit questioning of governance itself than before. In the past, social grievances tended to remain focused on concrete rights issues: wages, land, compensation, healthcare. Recently, they have begun to mutate beyond rights defense into objections carrying political meaning. The key to understanding China in early 2026 lies not in conspicuous major incidents, but in these shifts in psychological thresholds. Social order is not sustained by institutions alone. It is maintained only as long as people believe they can still endure. If that belief collapses, surface-level calm can shatter in an instant. What is being observed across China today are signals that precisely such cracks are quietly spreading. Hashtag internal disintegration exposed by anti-corruption rhetoric turbulence within the party, bureaucracy, and military. From late 2025 into 2026, tensions have also been rising within the governing apparatus itself. On the surface, slogans such as strengthening discipline, self-revolution, and deepening anti-corruption are repeated, reaffirming a narrative that the system can purify itself. Yet the figures and personnel movements that actually emerge suggest a different direction. As the number of investigations, punishments, and political downfalls increases, the perception that grows stronger is not that corruption has diminished, but that it was structurally embedded. Particularly striking is the succession of unsettling signs appearing in areas once considered core pillars of power. Senior officials disappearing in sequence, frequent absences from key meetings, continued stripping of titles or representative status. These developments go beyond isolated warning examples and evoke internal tensions and failures of factional coordination. While it is difficult to determine the full picture from outside, the more these movements overlap, the more exponentially the cost of performing governance stability rises. When tremors are discussed within the military and security sectors, the implications are even heavier. The ultimate support of any system lies not in the economy or propaganda, but in the apparatus of coercion. If distrust and conflicting interests are accumulating within it, the psychological foundations of governance inevitably weaken. As anti-corruption campaigns drag on, a pervasive sense spreads internally that no one knows who is safe. Displays of excessive loyalty increase, while caution deepens. Organizations appear to function, yet decision-making slows, a condition often described as strategic paralysis. Anti-corruption efforts are, in principle, meant to restore governing legitimacy. But when investigations become constant and even symbolic figures are targeted, society increasingly interprets the situation differently. That corruption was not an exception, but the norm. The more opaque the criteria for enforcement appear, the more readily people view it as an expression of political struggle. Thus, anti-corruption comes to be read not as purification, but as a reflection of internal conflict, producing a reversal in which the very tool intended to reinforce legitimacy instead erodes it. Crucially, shifts in social psychology and internal power. Tensions are unfolding simultaneously. As external dissatisfaction grows, internal discipline tightens. As discipline tightens, social suffocation intensifies. As suffocation intensifies, language sharpens. As sharper language proliferates, internal vigilance escalates, deepening political rigidity in a self-reinforcing cycle. Economic slowdown accelerates this process. In the past, growth functioned as a buffer. As long as jobs existed, incomes rose, and some vision of the future remained, people could swallow discontent. But when growth falters, housing assets wobble, and younger generations can no longer imagine a future, the implicit exchange underpinning governance collapses. The system then seeks to maintain order not through prosperity, but through management. Yet intensified management fails to generate trust, instead amplifying fear and backlash. The stricter the controls over party, bureaucracy, and military become, the more stable governance may appear in the short term. Over the long term, however, fear-based order is costly. Cooperation and initiative decline, institutions stiffen, frontline actors retreat, and early detection of problems is delayed. Systems in which information fails to flow upward are inherently fragile. Small fractures accumulate until, at some point, they surface all at once. Looking toward 2026, the fact that internal alertness is rising is not merely a rumor of power struggles. When social dissatisfaction becomes visible and economic capacity diminishes, internal cohesion becomes even more critical. If that cohesion falters, the system is forced to remain simultaneously on edge both inwardly and outwardly. Such a condition is not stability, but a precarious equilibrium sustained by tension that is difficult to maintain. Hashtag external pressure, resources, and chain shocks, when isolation and domestic unrest advance. Together, discussing governance risk in China cannot rely on domestic factors alone. From 2025 to 2026, shifts in the international environment have increasingly stimulated domestic vulnerabilities. Trade frictions, sanctions, export controls, realignment of alliances, and heightened scrutiny over energy and raw material flows. These external pressures are heavy on their own, but their impact multiplies when they coincide with rising domestic instability. Energy and transportation issues, in particular, are directly tied to the economy's lifeblood. The more import-dependent resources are concentrated along politically risky routes, the more the premise of stable supply is undermined. Even if cheap supply is secured, rising transport costs, insurance premiums, and risk premiums gradually squeeze domestic industry. As manufacturing profitability deteriorates and employment becomes unstable, domestic discontent grows further. Compounding the challenge is the way international news functions as a mirror for domestic public opinion. When reports emerge of authoritarian systems wobbling abroad, people at home project their own realities onto those images. The tighter information controls become, the more fragmented information turns symbolic and amplifies emotion. External events do not directly generate protest. Rather, reactions to those events act as a thermometer for shifts in domestic psychology. Especially notable in early 2026 is the transformation of online discourse. Comment sections once aligned with official narratives are now filled with overt cynicism and pointed questions. The more propaganda repeats its familiar script, the colder the response becomes. When the language of authority no longer works, the system resorts to harsher language. Yet harsh language cannot erase lived pain. As governance tilts from explanation toward command, social alienation deepens. Economically, multiple pressures operate simultaneously. Adjustments in the housing market, exhaustion of local government finances, youth employment difficulties, contraction of private investment, and cooling consumer sentiment. These forces are interconnected. When housing falters, the wealth effect shrinks and consumption declines. Declining consumption weakens corporate profits and employment. Falling employment reduces tax revenue, placing local governments under further strain. As strain intensifies, control and extraction increase, social friction grows, governance costs rise, and remaining capacity erodes. A vicious cycle. Under such conditions, maintaining social order requires more than enforcement alone. What is needed is a future people can believe in, a minimum expectation that tomorrow will not be worse than today. Yet when difficulty rises simultaneously across education, employment, marriage, childbirth, housing, healthcare, and old age, presenting such a future becomes exceedingly difficult. What people seek are not grand slogans, but tangible improvements in lived reality. Thus, the focus of 2026 is not whether a single major incident will erupt. Rather, it is how daily frictions accumulate in chains, wearing down society's psychological resilience. Even if protest expressions remain fragmented, their simultaneous increase across regions is perceived as spread. The tighter internal controls become, the stronger the sense of enclosure grows. The higher external pressure rises, the more economic capacity shrinks. When these three forces overlap, the system is forced to remain hypervigilant in three directions at once. History shows that regimes do not collapse simply because discontent exists, but because the loss of hope outweighs fear. Fear silences people. The loss of hope mobilizes them. The anxiety enveloping China in 2026 does not stem from a single cause. Economic contraction, rigid governance, erosion of trust, and changes in the international environment are acting together, cultivating a sense of reaching the limit deep within society. What is visible now is merely the prelude.